Hi, Mickey.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm sick, but
I'm sorry to hear that.
But I make the effort for Blogging Heads TV.
It's the kind of trooper you are.
I know. It's the show must go on.
You are an inspiration. Well, at least you're not in Iraq.
That's a great transition, Bob.
Thank you.
Everybody seems to report that even Iraq, the model, for example, the normally optimistic but lately pessimistic Iraq, the model, is reporting that the security situation has deteriorated with more of these reprisal killings and an obvious attempt to provoke reprisal killings with these killings in Sadr City yesterday.
Yeah, and apparently they did provoke some reprisal killings. Within Sadr City, apparently, at last count, 4 Sunni guys were apprehended somewhere in the vicinity. I must admit,
I wasn't impressed with either 4 or the fact that at least they were seen to be trying to hunt down the people who were responsible for the terrorism, as opposed to just random attacks on innocent Sunnis, which is, a total horror. I mean, they're both pretty horrible, but
there's a fine line. There's a good piece in the Los Angeles Times today about how exactly it is that these sectarian divisions, that the cleavages deepen. People are they're no longer crossing lines to go to markets where they could get more money for things. They had a vivid story about, a case of ethnic cleansing where a Shiite is leaving the neighborhood and he's not alienated from his Sunni neighbors. They're not the ones doing the ethnic cleansing. It's outsider Sunnis who come in and kill the occasional Shiite, and then the Shiites leave.
Right.
And he wishes a tearful goodbye to his Sunni neighbors. It's really sad.
There was a story like that in the Washington Post. Is that the one you're talking about?
I thought this was in the... Oh, you're right. That was in the Post. And what was in the Times was a pretty good piece on Muqtada al-Sadr, who I think is probably strengthened by all of this. Juan Cole alluded to some Arab media source arguing that Sadr had been weakened by the attacks on in his stronghold in Baghdad because he's responsible for security there. But I've got to think it's more like Bush and 9/11. Even though Bush was technically responsible for security, in the short term, this strengthens al-Sadr, and it would take a lot of these setbacks before he started losing ground. And it becomes an excuse for his militia to assert itself, which it's doing.
There's a troubling note in Krauthammer's column. I had always assumed that Sadr had sort of become a semi-force for stability because he's trying to get ahead in the electoral system. And Krauthammer says no, he just wants everything to fall apart so he can seize power, which is... makes him a much less benign figure.
He may have a plan for either contingency. I don't know. I mean, he's definitely, I think, ultimately a pretty ruthless guy. Yeah, the Krauthammer column was funny. First of all, odd. First of all, because it was very mild in tone. I think that was because pretty much everyone he was writing about he dislikes about equally. But he was arguing that it was good news. Of course, this was before the weekend. It was right before the weekend. He was arguing that there was good news in Iraq, that because the Kurds were teaming up with the Sunnis, and on behalf of a unified national government. But my take is that all the Kurds wanted was Kirkuk, which is an issue between them and the Shiites, and they wanted to get the Sunnis on their side for that. And I think the Kurd plan is to bail out in the long run anyway. Which raises the question of whether maybe, I think we've talked about this, maybe it isn't time to start thinking about how you might guide the nation in a relatively graceful fashion toward a breakup. Does that seem crazy to you? I mean, it just seems to me we've been so consistently behind the curve,
It doesn't seem crazy, but isn't the best way to do it to elect a unity government and let them do it?
Ideally, and I guess is Parliament going to convene in a few days or something, and maybe they'll get some traction. I just have this feeling that it's almost, that would probably be involved. That might be involved, but I mean, I think some planning on our part would be helpful as well.
The one positive development is that everybody seems to report that the Iraqi army, unlike the Interior Department police force, is behaving fairly well. and that the people do seem to trust them to restore order in a non-sectarian fashion. So that's a good thing. It implies
good thing, but there's a lot of Interior Ministry, troops to unsettle things, and I think even the Army is actually mostly Shiite and Kurd.
The Army is starting to patrol with the police forces to sort of keep them under control. Of course, that it might have the opposite effect. It might infect the Army with sectarianism.
Yeah.
But anyway, but I don't know. How does one go about partitioning a country? I mean,
I don't know. I mean, there was a time when it could have been done more gracefully. I mean, we could have steered them toward a kind of a loose federalism, with complete breakup being an option down the road.
Well, the Sunnis would never have been happy with that. They would.
Well, no. Although there is. I mean, the reason is there's no oil where they are.
Right.
That's true. But if you're looking for ways to make lemonade out of lemons, and it seems to me that at this point that's all you're going to be doing in Iraq, at best. It's true. I mean, if you imagine a Sunni state without oil, the good news is that it wouldn't have any oil, because oil is a big problem in the Middle East. It basically just exerts a corrupting influence on societies and governments. Right. I mean, it's a big part of the problem. I think most people agree now.
It's like welfare. It's free money.
It's not just Arab states. It was like countries like Norway when they discovered it offshore. They had problems. It's just problematic to get a whole lot of free wealth dumped on what turns out usually to be a few people. So anyway, you would have the option of an oilless state. Of course, you would need a Marshall Plan. At least you need a Marshall Plan for all of Iraq in the end, if it's going to get pacified. But you need a mega Marshall Plan in a Sunni state. But who knows? You could succeed in integrating it into the global economy. I think that would be a priority with the whole place. We'd all drop our trade barriers to their exports and so on, and maybe do a little enlightened industrial planning. I don't know. I'm obviously grasping.
What do the Sunni areas of the country have to sell the world? Not much.
Well, no. You build factories. I mean, that's where the Marshall Plan comes in. They have presumably, potentially industrious people.
And what do you do with Baghdad?
Baghdad, I think you might make a special case, and in this scenario, maybe you could say that you're going to keep Baghdad this special, like a fourth political entity, for now a kind of, maybe operated under UN governance or something. But in any event, it's the most problematic area because it's the most integrated residentially. But this might, in theory, allow you to focus your military resources there in order to keep order there. I mean, right now, certainly the American troops are just hopelessly overstretched. I don't know. I give up. There is no...
It doesn't seem promising to me, because then you have 3 countries surrounding Baghdad, and each of those provinces will direct its resources to making trouble in Baghdad. So you have...
I'm not sure they all would. I'm not sure it would necessarily be in their interests. I mean, the ultra-radicals, notably the outsiders, that's true of. But, I don't know. I give up. How much time did we eat up getting nowhere there? Do you have anything sunny to say, or any kind of ideas about...
I've already said my sunny things. I thought it was depressing that even Krauthammer, one of the most bellicose of the neocons, at the end of his column, his basic thing is, let's patch something together and get out. That was the basic tone of it, anyway.
Yeah.
So if that's the extreme of triumphalism,
yeah,
that makes a wide range of...
A lot of people are singing that tune. They laughed at Jack Murtha, but as Suzanne Nossel in a post on Democracy Arsenal makes the point that it would have been a lot easier to get out then than it's going to be to get out in the middle of a civil war, because for one thing, it looks like more abject surrender.
Oh, I think it was bad to get out then, too. I'm not for getting out.
Well, yeah, I don't know what I'm for, but I haven't heard a good scenario about what productive role American troops play, what really important and productive role American troops play if this gets much further out of hand.
Building up the army seems to be a good thing as opposed to the police force. And, presumably we can do something to keep order.
Yeah.
I don't know. Okay.
Okay, so we're depressed. But now, fortunately, we're moving on to a much more uplifting topic, Mickey. I was just wondering if you had any views on the subject of Ann Coulter. Do you know her work at all? Have you?
I have a vague memory that we've talked about this before, but
let me refresh your memory.
Me. Yeah, okay. But don't go over the whole thing.
What's that?
You promised value added. You're going to add something to the debate.
Yes, I am.
As opposed to rehash the emotional highs and lows.
Moreover, I'm going to be more calm and collected than ever this time.
Okay.
There's an ascending curve
Hard to believe. Hard
of
to
equanimity.
believe it's even possible for you to be calmer.
When we last left this subject, I had failed. I had tried to convince you that A, she's a McCarthyite, B, you should therefore no longer associate with her.
Well, of course she's a McCarthyite. She wrote a book favorable to McCarthy.
No, but McCarthyite doesn't just mean you think there were some favorable things about him. It means you employ his more disreputable tactics.
Yes.
And I don't think I don't know if you bought that premise, but in
I
any
don't
event,
buy that premise.
You were not going to disassociate yourself with her. One thing you said was, listen, she hasn't said anything racist, has she? Now, in the meanwhile, our helpful viewers sent in a couple of things. One of them sent in this nice picture of her posing proudly by McCarthy's gravestone, and I'll link to that or stick it in here or something. But another one brought something to my attention, which had not been there before, which is that only a few weeks ago, in a speech, she used the term ragheads to refer to Muslims. Now, I assume you would agree that that's an ethnic slur.
It's a slur. I don't think it's the equivalent of the N-word.
You don't?
No.
Because it's a religion and not a race?
I don't think you're saying that people are one group of people is inferior to the other.
Well, the N-word doesn't denote that. It's just that the N-word came to be offensive to... In fact, originally it was just almost a Southern pronunciation of the word Negro. It's just that black people came to be offended by it.
No, I think it came to mean inferior person.
It came to connote that, whereas you would say raghead connotes her utter respect for Muslims?
I put that in... no, of course not. But and I don't defend it, but I don't think it's as bad as the most vicious category of ethnic slur. It's sort of a standard derisive
standard
epithet.
thing you'd say to a Muslim if you met him at a.
No, but there are all sorts of terms you wouldn't say to people that don't rise to.
Right, and if it's because an ethnic group finds it highly offensive, we call it an ethnic slur, Mickey.
But yes, but I said it wasn't racist. I didn't say she never used it.
Okay, so are you conceding that it's an ethnic slur?
You always play these word games with me, Bob. It depends what ethnic slur is. I said what I thought it is. It's a dismissive ethnic term. Yes.
Okay, so it is an ethnic slur.
I haven't said that, have I?
Oh, I thought that was a yeah at the end of that last sentence. Well, let me try to convince you that regardless of how you want to categorize it, first of all, I haven't heard a good, clear, functional distinction between that and an ethnic slur from you. But secondly, let me try to convince you that it's exactly analogous to the N-word. Ultimately, the reason our society had to stigmatize the N-word and all other things that were considered slurs by black people is that it would ultimately have torn the social fabric apart had we not stigmatized them, okay? It was in the end a pragmatic justification. You could come up with moral justifications that I would accept as well, but it was ultimately it was also simply a pragmatic call. It was not in the national interest to go around associating with people who use terms like that, and so people like you and me started disassociating ourselves from them. Now, the analogy is that her using speech like that threatens the nation's social fabric and the world's social fabric, okay? I mean, in a way, the worst thing that could happen in the war on terrorism is if American Muslims become highly alienated. And by the way, this is also the problem with something you and Ann Coulter support, which is ethnic profiling at airports. Terrible idea because of the way it would be perceived by American Muslims. This is probably the greatest threat, and I'm almost surprised we haven't had more trouble on that front than we've had, because it seems to me if I were a Muslim now, it would be very easy for me to get in the mindset that people were looking at me and wondering, and you know, that has a destructive effect on your psychology, and you can start getting alienated whether or not there are good valid grounds for it. A week or two ago, Andrew Sullivan linked to some story about, I think it was a Muslim college student or on a college campus or something in Florida, who kind of went over the edge and I think plowed into some people with a car or something. And Andrew's interpretation, I think there was maybe some evidence for this, was that it had to do with exactly this issue. So this was one guy who exceeded the boiling point. And I submit to you that if we don't immediately, as a society, systematically stigmatize people who use ethnic slurs directed toward Muslims, we are in serious, serious trouble. And this is no joke.
I wouldn't use that ethnic slur, but you're playing this game of you're playing this sort of second order bank shot game of you have to disassociate yourself with people who use words you wouldn't believe, and
that's the way our strongest moral sanctions work.
But I also think that if you rigorously enforce a PC mindset, that also encourages a rebellion on the other side.
So you would associate.
And I also don't think we want to indulge the psychology of victimization that says every time a Muslim is searched at an airport that he has a right to be indignant and say I'm innocent and et cetera, et cetera. I don't think it's irrational. That's something to be indulged when blacks feel victimized. I don't think it's something to be indulged when Jews feel victimized. In general, there's a way too much I'm victimized attitude that we indulge in our society, and so there's a reason to push back in the opposite direction.
Well, as for your first point, that it's one thing to not use the terms yourself, but when you start disassociating yourself from such people, you're indulging in political correctness. So would you associate with people? Would you call yourself a friend of someone who used the N-word?
I think the N-word is qualitatively worse than ragging.
Okay, what is the difference between
one implies racial inferiority. The other implies.
Well, you don't think she's suggesting that this is an inferior religion? You said yourself she believes Islam is a religion of violence, for one thing. This seems to me to be going further than that, denigrating individual Muslims.
Does one have to say that all religions are of completely equal validity?
No, but you use a term. You don't think she's trying to denigrate individual Muslims en masse? You don't think that's the effect of that term?
I said it's not a racist term. There's a difference between.
I'm not saying it's a racist term. I'm saying it's an ethnic slur exactly on par with the N-word.
You said there was no distinction, and I'm saying that's the distinction.
Oh, so you're saying the distinction is that it's a religion and not a race?
Well, race is something that's in your genes. You can't change. Religion is something you can change.
So that's the distinction?
It's much more offensive to say you're an inferior. And this is even this is. A distinction enshrined in constitutional law to say that something is, you can't change it. It's inherent in you. To discriminate against that is worse than to discriminate against ideas. And
so religion
is an idea.
What about anti-Semitic slurs? I mean, after all, you can convert to Judaism. It's not a biological condition. You can convert. So would you say that you would gladly associate and call yourself a friend of people who use anti-Semitic slurs?
Which anti-Semitic slur? I defended Jesse Jackson when he said, we go down that New York was Hymietown.
Well,
I thought
first of all, was that a private conversation that was revealed?
Sorry?
Was that a private conversation that was revealed?
Well, yes, it was, but
Okay, so this is not someone who's making a habit and a policy of going around and publicly using that term, which Ann Coulter apparently is.
We were talking about, did I have a hair trigger about anti-Semitic slurs, and I don't. That was my point.
So if somebody uses the things that Jews find highly offensive on a regular basis publicly in a clearly derogatory way, you're like, oh yeah, you can be my friend, because that's not my attitude.
It depends what it is, but there are a lot of people who say things that a lot of Jews would find highly offensive, because the Jewish community rightly has a very, very low threshold of anger, and that I do associate with, yes.
Well, in any event, my parting sermon would be, this is an issue that America should get clear on right away. This kind of stuff should be in the category of the N-word. Ann Coulter's going to schedule to speak at Loyola University in Chicago. I think the Jesuits at Loyola should be ashamed of themselves. Although it was scheduled before she said this, but I think if they host her, that's an outrage, and is inconsistent with the principles that Jesuits and Catholics in general would subscribe to, would purport to uphold.
I mean, is your theory that we can't imagine any religion that would be offensive, that we couldn't tolerate, that all religions are by definition benign, that there are no religions that we can say that's a screwed up religion? Is that what your book's about? That because religions all answer the same human needs, that they all can, by definition, somehow miraculously be tolerated?
Well, that's a complicated question, but that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm saying we have an ethnic group here whose alienation would be very bad for the nation and for the world, and that ultimately that's one good way of deciding what you should stigmatize, and that's my argument. Now, if you're asking me, is Ann Coulter right to say Islam is a religion of war? No, that's a stupid oversimplification.
Okay, but what about my question is there something inherent in the nature of religions that makes them all, we can always tolerate? This is the problem I had with your New York Times op-ed. You say, well, we should let each religion sort of tell us what it finds most offensive, and then we should respect that and not offend them. Why is it that all religions will inherently deem something offensive that we can not offend? What if they say, we find democracy offensive, we find equal rights for women offensive?
Well, obviously you draw the line in places like that, Mickey.
Offensive.
You draw the line, and if they start asking you to indulge in self-censorship in, say, the realm of science or even explicit political argumentation,
wait.
That's too high a price to pay.
They're not asking for self-censorship. They're asking for censorship. They do not want Denmark to allow these cartoons to be published.
Mickey, if there was anything my op-ed was clear on, and it has certainly been misunderstood by the Ann Coulters of the world, and apparently by you, if there was anything it was clear on, it was a distinction between censorship and self-censorship, and my endorsing the latter and not the former.
Right, but you didn't confront the issue, which is that they don't respect that distinction. So what are you going to do about that? That's the problem.
Well,
the problem is they're protesting the cartoons by protesting against the government of Denmark, which means they don't recognize your distinction. So what are you going to do about a group of people that don't recognize your distinction?
I don't have a solution to all the world's problems, and if I were Denmark, I would say, sorry, we're not going to engage in censorship, which I think is what Denmark's saying. My article said nothing inconsistent with that.
Right, but I'm saying is, you're saying that, basically implying that Islam can be completely tolerated, and I'm saying, what if they insist that there's no distinction between censorship and self-censorship, and they demand censorship? Then
you say, you lose. In our society, at least, that's what we have control over. You lose. I don't understand what this has to do with my op-ed, Mickey. I really don't.
I thought you did not say what you just said in your op-ed.
No, I said...
You ducked the issue. You did not play Notre Dame.
No, I mean, first of all, the op-ed wasn't about how do you handle this outrage now that it's been aroused. The op-ed was like, what should our policy be? There are people like Andrew Sullivan saying, no, never engage in self-censorship. I was pointing out, actually, A, we do it all the time. B, it's worked pretty well here. C, in the future, I recommend it. If you're a newspaper editor trying to decide whether to publish a picture of Muhammad with a bomb in a turban, I say, don't do it. We shouldn't have a law against it. But I think we should use moral sanction to discourage that kind of thing.
I agree with all that. We've clarified it now.
Well, anyway, I'm really serious about this Coulter thing. Hundreds of Loyola students have signed a petition against her appearing there because they're using although it's organized by a bunch of Republicans or some Republican club or conservative club, they're using student activity fund money to pay her fee of apparently $24,000. You get to talk to her for less than that, right, Mickey? So they're not even getting a very good deal. And I think it'd be a wonderful thing if there were protests, not so much by Muslims, but by Christians and Jews and right-thinking secular people. This is a line we shouldn't cross. This should be in the category of the N-word, in my view, and this is all I have to say.
Well, I respect your views, but
I respect your view.
Sorry?
I respect your view.
Thank
Mickey,
you.
I disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it.
Thank you. Okay, we're approaching sanctimony now here, so let's ring the bell.
Okay. China, you know, the first two took 24 minutes. Do we really want to talk about China?
Yeah, well, let's just do that quickly. There was an article in the New York Times about how there's a split in the Communist Party, that there's a whole sort of paleo-commie faction that says, well, capitalism's getting out of hand, it's producing inequality, and you somehow felt that, it was on the front page of the New York Times, I believe, on Sunday, you somehow felt that this would be used by people who oppose your view that China is inevitably trending toward democracy.
Yeah, because it's a reactionary backlash within the Communist Party by people who want the Communist Party to actually practice communist principles, which it hasn't done for a while now. And I assume that this would be taken by people who, you know, I'm of course of the school that the political drift of China is right now going pretty well. That economic liberty tends to bring political pluralism in the long run in the current technological environment. I assume this article would be seized on by people who beg to differ and say, look, right here, this is, you know, we're going backwards, not forward. And in fact, the Internet facilitated this thing. Apparently this movement, this reactionary movement, began with a manifesto that was circulated on the Internet. My point would be that this is just, first of all, it is evidence of political pluralism. Political pluralism involves a lot of points of view. And in fact, after reading that piece yesterday, I got up this morning and heard on the radio that there's also a movement within the Communist Party to take Mao's picture off of the currency and to put Deng Xiaoping's and maybe Sun Yat-sen's in its place.
So it's not like these leftists were calling for the suppression of free speech. They were calling for the limitation of inequalities of wealth.
Right.
So it seems to me that I don't see how your enemies could use them as an example of a failure of democracy. They're just debating over how much capitalism they want to have.
No, I think it would just be a reflex that would react to the piece that way. And in fact, although I anticipated it, I was disappointed to search Technorati today and find out that the only references to the article seemed to be on China language websites, and I couldn't find any American bloggers using it as evidence that technology is not in fact aiding political pluralism in China. No, I mean these reactionaries, these you know, neo-communists are actually standing up on behalf of some of the very people that the Americans had anticipated the reaction from. I don't know. They don't have a label yet.
But they're also using the techniques of free speech and democracy, thereby ensuring that they will survive.
Right, and they're standing up on behalf of these powerless peasants who need to be stood up on behalf of. Right now, they are voting with civil unrest.
There was one unbelievable statistic in that piece, which I didn't believe, which
200
is
per day?
200 incidents of mass unrest a day in China.
Yeah,
How can a country survive with that? Even a country as big as China. The phrase they translated, you know, it was one of these that they translated the phrase literally, and I couldn't tell whether it was serious civil disturbance or what. But a number of significant riots with people dying have made it into our media. There's more of them than there used to be, and those in turn are abetted by the internet, email, and so on. And that's, in my mind, that's a kind of a rough and ready example of political pluralism. That's why these people are ultimately going to have their interests taken into account. This reactionary is one person who wants to do it, but the government is more and more doing it, and in fact, they've postponed this vote on private property laws that are opposed by the reactionary, and I gather some of these peasants. But anyway, it's all good. It's all good, but there was a genuinely stupid New York Times article, we thought, by David Sanger.
Oh, I would not go that far in I'd never say that about one of my fellow journalists, but it was certainly curious, and it's on the front page of the New York Times.
A stupid article.
Yeah, stupid article written by a smart journalist. Here's the lead that got it onto the front page of the New York Times. The president who made preemption and going it alone the watchwords of his first term is quietly turning in a new direction. warning at every opportunity of the dangers of turning the nation inward and isolationist and making the case for international engagement on issues from national security to global economics. The key here is this premise that there is some contradiction between going it alone, which he was doing, and isolationism, which he's now warning against. Well, no. Going it alone is assertive unilateralism. Isolationists don't want you to be assertively unilateralist. They want you to keep your army back on domestic soil. They don't want you to venture much in the outside world.
They were always opposed to it. It only makes sense in the idiotic New York Times mindset, which is, gee, isolationism is right-wing and unilateralism is right-wing. Therefore, it's interesting that he's opposing this right-wing thing.
It's weird.
But other than that, it made absolutely no sense at all.
No, it has other dimensions that he tries to use to bail himself out. Like now Bush is for economic engagement, whereas he used to avoid the word globalization as a Clinton term. Well, yeah, maybe the word, but he was always pro-economic engagement. Yeah. What he's never been, what he wasn't originally, was multilateral, and the fact that he drifted some degree in that direction some time ago was long ago noted. The weird piece, it also identifies William F. Buckley as a neoconservative to back up one of its other claims, and I don't think that's the way he's commonly labeled, although that's a term that could use some defining.
Our blogging head colleague, Matt Iglesias, had a pretty good post where he pointed out that Bush is now turning against isolationism, i.e., people who oppose his Iraq project are somehow isolationists. Well, you can certainly oppose what he did in Iraq without being an isolationist.
Count me in.
And that it's a little of a stretching the words isolationism to imply that it means you have to approve of every foreign adventure that an administration dreams up.
Yeah.
And, that there's plenty of people who are not isolationists who still oppose Iraq. I thought it was a good point to make.
Yeah, isolationism is often used to soil the reputation of people who disagree with it.
He's clearly worried about what is true is he's worried about the right wing peeling off on Iraq, and saying this was a bad move and opposing that involvement, and he's trying to tar it as isolationism. And that's why he mentioned it 55 times in the State of the Union. There must be some polling behind it that showed that this was a threat.
I think that's true.
But I agree it was a bogus lead. Shame on David Sanger.
Shame. Somebody who once worked for a competing newspaper in a bureau that was at that point competing with the bureau he was in said they used to have a term called Sangerized, where their editors would call them, read a Sanger piece in the New York Times, and they would then have to explain to their editors that actually there's less here than seems to meet the eye, that he managed to craft an angle out of this, but when you really look at it closely, there's a little less there. And when that happened to them, they said they had been Sangerized. I like a lot of his stuff, but this is bordering on bizarre, I would say.
Yeah. I agree.
Okay. Now, is this the sports? Are we onto the sports section? Yeah.
We're onto the sports section before the big thing section.
Barry Bonds, quickly. Just to establish the diversity of our knowledge. For those who aren't baseball fans, Barry Bonds has long been suspected of using illegal, in baseball at least, anabolic steroids. A book has just come out that I guess a lot of the evidence is anonymously sourced. There's a lot of it circumstantial, but it tends to add considerable weight to the case, I guess. And basically everyone who's been paying attention to, for example, the evolution of his physique, since he reached an age when his physique was in theory supposed to be getting less and less masculine, pretty much agrees that the guy's been on steroids. His productivity went up immensely exactly when it's supposed to decline. A lot of people in baseball are either known, a number of people are known to have or suspected of having used steroids, but he already owns one of the most hallowed records in baseball, home runs in a season. He's within striking distance of possibly the most hallowed, career home runs, and that's one reason this has created such a stir. Do you have a view on this, Mickey? I mean, there's a couple of issues. Should steroids be illegal? Malcolm Gladwell has argued no, I think. That you should just let it all fly.
No, it's a difficult issue because you get all these high schoolers taking steroids and screwing up their bodies when they have no chance of making the major leagues.
That, I think, is ultimately the reason the policy should be strictly enforced at the professional level. Because if it's not, and steroids are thought to be a way you really could make it into the big leagues, then for every major league player, there's like 5,000 high schoolers out there shooting up, and it's bad, has various bad side effects, including steroid rage. And last time I looked at male adolescent psychology, more rage wasn't what we needed to throw into the equation.
What you could do is you could have like a bifurcated, sports world where, in one case you were allowed to take all of the performance-enhancing drugs that you wanted, and we're going to get into this maybe later, but it's clear that there's, I've been reading Instapundit's book on the future. It's clear that there's way more coming down the road than steroids. Steroids are nothing compared with, the enhancements in performance that nanotechnologies, etc., are going to produce. We're going to have people, running around bases like the wind, like nothing you've ever seen. So we have one league where they do that, and another league where human beings just sort of stay within their normal parameters and don't take these things. And I wonder which would be more popular. It might be that the second one is more popular, and people would, subject themselves to rigorous drug testing.
Interesting question. They used to say about baseball that part of its appeal was that the players looked more or less normal compared to basketball or football. That's really increasingly not true. These guys are just bizarrely humongous, the power hitters, certainly. And even pitchers are bigger and stronger than ever. I mean, another guy who's been implicated, by some maybe highly circumstantial evidence, Roger Clemens, the pitcher, another guy whose neck seems to get thicker the older he gets.
Well, him and Andrew Sullivan.
What?
Sorry.
Andrew has implicated himself in a New York Times Magazine piece.
I agree.
But he testified in that piece to the fact that it is conducive to rage.
No. But, so that's an interesting point, and I have to believe that the old-fashioned sort of human sports might eventually be more popular because, at some point you can imagine people doing these superhuman things, and so what? It's like you're watching special effects,
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting question, but. The other question is, should his records be erased? George Will argued no, because that would be Orwellian to rewrite history. And you actually technically wouldn't have to rewrite history. You don't have to say these hits didn't happen, these home runs didn't happen. You just have to say he does not qualify for holding the record. He doesn't get to hold the record. He's not listed in the record books.
But then Mark McGwire holds the records, and what about him?
Well, I mean, with both of these guys, there's the problem that I don't think they, in the Olympics, they actually do take medals away from people, but that's, I think, where they have hard evidence in the form of blood samples or something, and I don't think we have that in either case here. So it would be problematic in any event. But I think if they had it, they should take the record away. It's very hard to draw the line because amphetamine use is has been rampant for some time in professional sports.
Will effectively makes the case that it sort of doesn't matter. Everybody knows you took them, and and so even if he officially gets the record, everybody will put a mental asterisk after that.
That was what George Will wound up saying.
It is what it is.
And just the last thing on that subject, I was in a Washington restaurant recently, and George Will was at the adjacent table, and do you know what
he was
tune his
steroids.
Cell phone ring is? You should be able to guess it just on the basis of the context of this discussion.
Take me out to the ball game.
You got it. And it's louder than it really has to be, I'll tell you.
That's incredibly cliched and embarrassing.
He had just, I heard him, not that I'm the type to eavesdrop, but I heard him say that he had just gotten it for Christmas.
We probably hasn't had time to change it to Born in the USA or something.
Probably it. So did I hear in the course of that discussion a hint that maybe you're about to deliver Blogging Heads TV's first book report?
Well, no, I am reading Instapundit's book, An Army of Davids. Everybody has to be nice to Instapundit because he's the all-powerful hit king, and he can.
And I think one of the finest human beings ever to walk the face of the earth.
He actually is a pretty nice guy, and I do like the book. But people should know that there is this imperative to be nice to the 800-pound gorilla of the blogosphere. He has a good influence on the blogosphere because he's an academic brat. He knows a little about a lot of things. He's Catholic
And
in
a
his
lot
taste.
about a lot of things.
And he's relatively tolerant, so he links to left and right. So if he didn't exist, the blogosphere would be a much more sectarian and harsh and Hobbesian place.
I'd hate to live in a world without him.
But he's written this book, which is basically about, it's a totally technologically determinist book about how technology is empowering individuals, starting with the internet and going up through nanotechnology all the way to this term, the singularity, which is when everything starts changing so fast that we no longer recognize the world as the world we've been living in. And there's sort of three issues of that. One is what happens to community in this atomized world of everybody, everybody working on their little laptop and talking on their cell phone and not being part of any big organization. And his answer seems to be that we're all working in sort of semi-communal third places that are, like Starbucks, sponsored by commercial outfits. And it's sort of semi-convincing on that score. The second is how do you transmit morality and values in this decentralized world where there are no massive factory-like schools, sticking values in kids' heads. And he has a semi-plausible, a less plausible chapter on how sort of video games sort of impart, somehow have succeeded in imparting values to people. Perversely, he thinks violent games and pornography have led to a more moral generation.
I beg to differ.
And
does he address the fact that the Columbine kids were avid Doom players?
He mentions it. He doesn't address it directly. And the third thing is this world scary or not? Because he acknowledges, as you acknowledge in your book, that all these things...
You mean my book, Nonzero?
In your book, Nonzero, that all these, which I have around here somewhere, but I don't have to hold up to the camera, that all these things empower terrorists just as well, even more or as much as they empower ordinary people. And he doesn't quite convince me that this isn't an unstable situation we're heading toward. I mean, if you imagine technology that gave everybody in the world a nuclear, a bomb and a button that they could push, that would lead to an unstable situation. I mean, there's no reason to think that 99 times out of 100 that wouldn't end up with the world being blown up. Why aren't we heading toward that situation? He has, a bunch of optimistic arguments, but, I'm a paranoid. None of them convince me.
Yeah, but you are about the toughest sell. I mean, I actually am impressed by how history does... technological evolution does tend to create solutions more or less commensurate with the problems it creates. But nonetheless, you do have these epic kind of instabilities in moving from one kind of technologically shaped stage to another. And I'm as much of a technological determinist as Glenn is, and I think it sounds like I would agree with a fair amount of this book. But there are these upheavals. I mean, I do think that the wars of religion, first the Reformation, then the wars of religion, which was a lot of killing, had a lot to do with the way power was decentralized by the printing press. And now we're undergoing another period of decentralized power, and in a way the big question is, can you make the transition gracefully? Ultimately, there will probably be solutions, but when you're talking about a situation where one person successfully sneaking a nuke into a port could put the world on a slippery slope to a true clash of civilizations and the collapse of civilization, I get a little scared.
Well, if you're scared, I'm definitely scared.
If I'm scared, you're terrified.
Yes. And I was wondering, in your book, Nonzero, you talk about the sweep of human history being a sort of drive toward greater and greater complexity. And it seems to me that you didn't take into account a whole bunch of technologies that he talks about in this book.
They were probably just the ones that didn't support my argument. Don't worry.
But don't you feel that you need to revise your book?
Oh, you mean like nanotechnology?
Yes.
Well, that's consistent with what I said about nanotechnology, in terms of the dangers it poses, is the functional equivalent of biological weapons. I mean, this is, when Bill Joy made a lot of news.
Nanotechnology is technology at the molecular level.
Very, very small. Yeah. And one thing it can be is, in principle, self-replicating.
Right.
But that just makes it the functional equivalent, in a way, of a biological weapon. I mean, if you imagine a malign version of nanotechnology, it's small, self-replicating, out of control.
Well, no, because at some point, which Ray Kurzweil puts at the year 2029, these things begin to think for themselves. So it's not just that you're putting bioweapons or similar weapons in the hands of humans. You're putting bioweapons in the hands of the bioweapons.
That's a long metaphysical argument. Well, there's a metaphysical version of it and a non-metaphysical version of it. I remain unconvinced, although I thought The Matrix was a great movie. It's not totally clear to me that you ever quite cross that threshold, although I do think, does he use in this book the term superorganism to refer to society? I do think we're moving in that direction.
No, he doesn't.
Oh, I think that part's, you do move to a kind of a superorganic. I mean, that's not to say global society will possess the unity of a superorganism. That's kind of the great question. But even if you just look at like an individual corporation, more and more has, in terms of fine-grained division of labor and efficiency, more and more the cast of a superorganism. It's technologically mediated. But, whether the Matrix scenario, I don't know about. Does Glenn buy the Matrix scenario?
He doesn't talk about it, but I don't understand, why do you think that we won't cross the threshold where these machines think for themselves? I mean, at some point they will have more brain power than a human brain.
I think the answer is because there's already a sense in which they're thinking for themselves. We are symbiotic with them. Computers are dependent on us for their replication. We are increasingly dependent on computers for our replication. On the other hand, we're writing the code, and I think the question is kind of, when does that change?
Well, we are this week, yeah.
But I don't dismiss. I mean, that's a long argument in its own right. Where does the title come from? Who is David?
Well, it's David versus Goliath. In other words, his argument is that the Industrial Revolution gave us big Goliath-like organizations because the technology of the era required centralization and large scale. And now technology is empowering small, David-like packs of empowered individuals who can take down these big Goliaths. The way bloggers are taking down big media, for example.
Now, doesn't he have some scenario where security resides? Security is this very diffuse, decentralized thing, ultimately brought to us by individual citizens.
He has this notion of a pack, not a herd, which is that empowered individuals operate as an intelligent pack in stopping terrorism. And the big example is, the way the people on Flight 93 figured out what was up and stopped that attack by storming the cockpit. In a matter of hours after, the previous paradigms of terrorism had changed. He doesn't really. It's not that plausible that this could provide a very foolproof, barrier against terrorism. A lot of it is, do empowered individuals know how to apply first aid after the terrorists have blown up a large chunk of your city? Well, that's not a very good barrier. But he doesn't really push it that hard.
Yeah,
he just argues that the centralized federal government doesn't give it enough credit.
Yeah, okay, but still, I would work on both fronts. Especially in these, it only takes one kind of scenarios,
That was one of the least convincing to a paranoid like me chapters in the book. But it dovetails with his belief in the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms, because this pack will be armed. So you get the entire Instapundit Weltanschauung in one book. And it really does all fit together.
Well, this is where I might differ. I think we're going to need to regulate biotechnology and ultimately nanotechnology in ways that it's not currently regulated.
He would disagree, I think.
He might, but I'm unconvinced that we can do anything less than that and survive. And the other, this also gets back to why I think hatred is such a dangerous thing, interethnic hatred, is because the upshot of the world he's describing, I think he might agree, is that more and more kind of grassroots hatred can morph into massive lethality without being mediated by a nation state. And if that's the world you're living in, the less hatred, the better. And so we're kind of back to Ann Coulter, but I don't want to dwell on her.
Yeah, I had one more point to make about Instapundit, which is he has great faith in self-organizing the capacity of large groups of diffuse individuals. This is sort of the pack, not a herd thing, about how he talks a lot about how the evacuation of Manhattan after 9/11 happened spontaneously and, without government centralized control. People just got together and got people off the island. He claims they evacuated 1 million people. That seems like quite a few. But my point is that the belief in this self-organizing ability is at the heart of the three biggest Bush fiascos. The idea that Iraq was going to be okay once we overthrew Saddam Hussein, that we weren't going to need a big centralized army, that they were going to spontaneously organize themselves into a relatively benign situation there. The fiasco of Katrina, where we seem to have had excessively great faith in the ability of neighborhoods of people who didn't evacuate the city to protect themselves. Some did, but some didn't. And the Medicare drug fiasco, where we sort of figured, well, people will figure out these complicated rules and spontaneously organize themselves into economically viable little insurance systems for whatever drugs they need. In all of these cases, the ability of large groups of people to spontaneously self-organize proved wanting.
Yeah, that happens. On the other hand, there are, I would argue that historically there are examples of kind of maybe in the longer run, society equilibrating through self-organization. I think after the collapse of the Roman Empire that happened more impressively than some people acknowledge. An example he presumably uses is, when the blogosphere first started, people were like, well, how do we know which sources to trust if none of them say the Washington Post at the top? But there came to be a kind of system of blogs linking to one another that made it not all that hard to assign varying degrees of credibility to varying blogs, right?
No, I agree. That one is almost so obvious he doesn't need to mention it, but he does. But presumably some scholar somewhere has figured out what makes some systems organize effectively and some systems not. And what's the difference between the blogosphere and Iraq? There must be some obvious difference.
The blogosphere in Iraq?
The blogosphere effectively self-organized. Iraq did not effectively self-organize.
True. There are absolutely limits, yes. As we now know to our...
It's good to see you on the same side of Bush and Donald Rumsfeld in favor of self-organization.
I'm not sure I would quite put it that way.
I think that's a...
No, Rumsfeld's latest line is that actually all the current strife was almost historically inevitable. He's saying the same thing that Chris Hitchens is saying, basically. He's great at dismissing, moving problems from his shoulders to somebody else's, and apparently, he was saying, look, these are centuries-old animosities, blah blah blah. I wish he and Chris Hitchens had clued us into that before the war.
But isn't there some truth to that? A lot of truth to that.
There was enough truth to it for me to oppose the war, although that wasn't the primary basis of my opposition. But I think now these guys are exaggerating it to relieve responsibility that rightly is theirs.
Okay, well, it's all Ann Coulter's fault, I think.
Like so many things, yes. Okay, so we're now close to the record for longest. We've still got a few minutes for commercials at the top of the hour, but we better stop before we lose that, I guess.
Cool.
Okay.
See you soon.
See you around.
Bye.